Mary Bell's story is one of the most haunting tales of criminal history, not because of the brutality of the crimes alone, but due to her age at the time. Mary Bell, often referred to as the Tyneside Strangler, shocked the world in 1968 when, at just 11 years old, she was convicted of killing two young boys. Born into a troubled and abusive household, Mary's life was marked by neglect, violence, and unimaginable trauma. This introduction delves into the complexities of her life, crimes, and their repercussions, painting a chilling portrait of a child killer and the societal failures that shaped her.
Mary Flora Bell was born on May 26, 1957 in Corbridge, Northumberland. From the very beginning, her life was marred by neglect and abuse. Her mother, Betty Bell, was a sex worker who often left Mary in the care of others while traveling to Glasgow for work. According to family members, Betty's behavior towards Mary was disturbingly abusive. She allegedly tried to harm Mary multiple times, including dropping her from a window and attempting to give her sleeping pills. Mary's father, Billy Bell, was a violent alcoholic with a criminal record, adding another layer of instability to her childhood. With no safe haven at home, Mary's early years were marked by a lack of parental affection and care. Her mother even reportedly encouraged clients to sexually abuse Mary during sadomasochistic sessions, further compounding the trauma. At school, Mary's behavior reflected her troubled home life. She was known for violent outbursts, mood swings, and chronic bedwetting, a common symptom of deep psychological distress. Her classmates and teachers often noticed her aggressive tendencies, including attempts to strangle or harm other children. Many of her peers avoided her, sensing her unpredictability. Mary's only close companion was Norma Bell, a slightly older girl who lived next door. Despite sharing a last name, the two were not related. Together, they engaged in petty mischief, but their relationship was far from innocent. Norma's submissive nature contrasted with Mary's dominant and manipulative personality, setting the stage for the tragic events to come. In May 1968, Mary's violent tendencies escalated. She and Norma were involved in an incident where a young boy was pushed off a ledge, suffering severe injuries. Shortly after, 3 young girls reported that Mary had attempted to strangle them. Despite these alarming incidents, authorities took no significant action, merely issuing warnings. The lack of intervention allowed Mary's behavior to spiral further. On May 25, 1968, the day before her 11th birthday, Mary committed her first murder. 4-year-old Martin Brown was found dead in an abandoned house. While no visible injuries were found, the circumstances raised suspicions. Mary later admitted to killing him, claiming she had a compulsion to hurt. The tragedy of Mary's childhood lies in the systemic failures that allowed her trauma to fester unchecked. The abuse she endured and the lack of support from authorities or caregivers contributed to her descent into violence, making her story a grim reflection of societal neglect. Mary Bell's crimes shocked the nation, not only for their brutality, but also because of her young age. Her first victim, Martin Brown, was discovered in an abandoned house on May 25, 1968, The 4-year-old's body showed no signs of visible trauma, leading to an initial assumption of accidental death. However, the presence of empty pill bottles near the scene added an air of mystery. Just one day later, Mary and Norma broke into a nursery, vandalizing the property and leaving cryptic notes that claimed responsibility for Martin's death. These notes, dismissed as a childish prank, were an eerie forewarning of what was to come. Mary's need for attention and her desire to assert control became evident in these actions. On July 31, 1968, Mary struck again. 3-year-old Brian Howe was last seen playing with Mary and Norma. When Brian failed to return home, a search party was organized. His body was discovered later that evening on a wasteland known as Tin Lizzie. Unlike Martin, Brian's body bore clear signs of violence, including strangulation marks and a crude M carved into his stomach. The injuries were inflicted with a pair of broken scissors and a razor blade. The discovery of Brian's body launched a large-scale investigation. Over 1,200 children were questioned, including Mary and Norma. While Norma appeared nervous and inconsistent in her statements, Mary's responses were calm and calculated. She even implicated another boy, claiming he had hurt Brian. However, her detailed knowledge of the crime scene, including the broken scissors, aroused suspicion. Eventually, Norma confessed, revealing Mary's role in both murders. She described how Mary had strangled Brian, demonstrating a disturbing lack of remorse. Forensic evidence further implicated Mary, with fibers from her clothing matching those found on both victims. The murders of Martin and Brian exposed the dark depths of Mary's psyche. Her actions were not impulsive but calculated, driven by a desire for control and a troubling detachment from empathy. These crimes marked her as one of Britain's youngest and most chilling killers. The trial of Mary Bell and Norma Bell began on December 5, 1968. The two girls faced charges for the murders of Martin Brown and Brian Howe. The prosecution argued that Mary was the dominant force, manipulating Norma into participating in the crimes. Their case was bolstered by forensic evidence in Mary's own statements, which revealed an unsettling understanding of her actions. The defense highlighted Mary's traumatic upbringing and her diagnosis of psychopathy, arguing that her actions stemmed from diminished responsibility. Expert witnesses described her as intelligent but emotionally disturbed, with a blurred sense of reality and fantasy. Norma, on the other hand, was portrayed as a submissive and naive accomplice, incapable of comprehending the gravity of the crimes. After 9 days of testimony, the jury reached their verdict. Mary Bell was found guilty of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, while Norma was acquitted. At just 11 years old, Mary was sentenced to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, an indefinite term reflecting the severity of her crimes. Mary's time in custody was marked by further challenges. She alleged abuse by staff and inmates, which deepened the scars of her already traumatic childhood. Despite these hardships, she pursued education and attempted to rebuild her life. In 1980, at the age of 23, she was released with a new identity and a lifelong anonymity order. Mary's release sparked public outrage, with many questioning the justice system's decision. Her anonymity became a contentious issue, especially when she co-authored a book detailing her life. Critics accused her of profiting from her crimes, while others argue that her story highlighted the need for systemic reforms. Today, Mary Bell's whereabouts remain unknown, protected by legal rulings that extend to her daughter and granddaughter. Her case continues to captivate public attention, serving as a grim reminder of the consequences of childhood trauma and the complexities of justice. While her victims' families mourn their loss, Mary's story prompts difficult questions about rehabilitation, punishment, and the capacity for change.
Okay, so are you ready to dive into a case that is really just perplexing?
I am.
The story of Mary Bell. She was convicted of manslaughter back in 1968
Wow.
at just 11 years old for the deaths of 2 young boys.
11 years old.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff.
Yeah, it is.
But we're going to go beyond just the headlines here. We're going to try and understand what went wrong.
Okay.
What this case tells us about childhood, responsibility, even the idea of justice. What's fascinating about this is it really forces us to look at the gray areas of human behavior. We tend to want those clear-cut distinctions between good and evil.
Yeah.
But Mary Bell's story really throws a wrench in that.
It does. It really does. That's what makes it so interesting. And I think so perplexing for a lot of people is that you have this young girl.
Right.
Who is responsible for the deaths of 2 very young boys.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So let's start with her early life. Mary was born in 1957. And to put it mildly, her childhood was incredibly tough.
To say the least. I mean, the sources paint a really bleak picture.
Yeah.
Her mother, Betty, was a sex worker who was often absent, leaving Mary in the care of various people. And when she was around, she was reportedly abusive. There are even accounts of her attempting to harm Mary as a child.
It's hard to even imagine what that must have been like as a young child. The things that are described in the material, like dropping her from a window as a baby or trying to give her sleeping pills, are just horrific.
Yeah.
And then, as if that wasn't enough, her father, Billy Bell, was a violent alcoholic with a criminal record. Stability and safety were in very, very short supply.
Yeah, and this is where things get interesting from a psychological perspective. You know, this level of sustained trauma. During a child's most formative years, it doesn't just disappear.
Yeah.
It fundamentally alters their understanding of the world, their relationships, even their sense of self.
Right, and we start to see evidence of this even in Mary's behavior at school.
Absolutely.
There were incidents of violence, extreme mood swings, bedwetting, really classic signs of a child that's desperately crying out for help. There are even reports of her trying to strangle other children.
Exactly. And it's important to understand that, you know, these weren't just typical, quote, bad kid behaviors.
Right.
These were clear warning signs, red flags that indicated a deep-seated distress. And it's just tragic that no effective intervention occurred at this point.
It really makes you wonder how things might have been different if she had received the help she clearly needed.
Absolutely. It's a question that haunts this case.
Yeah. Now, there's another key figure in this story that we need to talk about, Norma Bell.
Right.
She was Mary's friend and ultimately her accomplice in the crimes. Norma is described as being much more submissive, kind of a stark contrast to Mary's dominant personality. What are your thoughts on their dynamic?
Well, it's a complex relationship, no doubt. But it's possible that Norma, perhaps unconsciously, was drawn to Mary's stronger personality, you know, seeking a sense of belonging or purpose that she lacked. And for Mary, having someone who followed her lead may have fueled her need for control, which we see throughout the case.
So we have this extremely volatile mix, a deeply traumatized child with increasingly violent tendencies, a more passive friend, and a complete lack of support from any adults in their lives.
Wow.
It seems like a recipe for disaster.
And tragically, that's exactly what happened. In May of 1968, things took a very dark turn.
This is when the first tragedy occurs. Mary, just a day before her 11th birthday, is involved in the death of 4-year-old Martin Brown.
And initially, there was a lot of mystery surrounding Martin's death.
Right.
There weren't any obvious signs of injury. And some people thought that it was an accident.
Then Mary confesses to being involved in Martin's death.
Right.
This is a turning point.
Yeah.
It shifted the entire investigation.
And it brings up so many questions. You know, was this truly an impulsive act, a result of her trauma and a distorted worldview? Or was there a level of calculation involved? I mean, it's really hard to reconcile the idea of a child understanding the permanence of death.
It's almost impossible to wrap your head around it.
Yeah.
You have this young girl who endured unimaginable hardship, who seemed to be crying out for help.
Right.
And on the other hand, you have this horrific event that is impossible to ignore. It really makes you think about the line between victim and perpetrator. How blurry that can become.
It really does. It really challenges our conventional understanding of how those roles operate. And it forces us to acknowledge that sometimes they aren't very clear-cut. And then it raises difficult questions about justice.
Right.
How do you hold a child accountable when their actions are so deeply rooted in their own suffering?
Right. Where do you even begin to unpack something like it? It's a question we still grapple with today. But before we jump into the trial and the aftermath, let's rewind a bit and go back to the events leading up to the second tragedy.
Yeah, because there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
Particularly Mary's actions following Martin's death.
Okay, let's talk about that. So just a day after Martin's body is found, Mary and Norma break into a nursery. And they didn't just vandalize it.
Right.
They left behind these chilling notes claiming responsibility for Martin's death.
Imagine, discovering those notes, unsure if it's a childish prank or something much more sinister. It creates this unsettling blend of childhood innocence and something really disturbing.
Really does. On the surface, you have these two kids messing around.
Yeah.
But underneath, there's this dark undercurrent, this need for attention and control that just sends shivers down your spine.
Right. And that need for control, it becomes even more pronounced in what happens next.
Right.
This wasn't just a crime. It was almost like a statement, a declaration.
A statement that was tragically followed by another act of violence, one that was even more brutal.
Just weeks later, 3-year-old Brian Howe went missing. He was last seen playing with Mary and Norma. When his body was found, the details were far more disturbing than in Martin's case.
The sources describe evidence that suggests Brian was strangled. And there was something else. A mark carved into his stomach.
Yeah.
It's a level of brutality that is almost impossible to comprehend, especially coming from someone so young.
This escalation in violence,
Yeah.
from the somewhat ambiguous circumstances of Martin's death to the deliberate brutality inflicted on Brian, it's truly disturbing, and it really suggests a progression in Mary's emotional detachment and her need to exert power in a very dark way.
It almost seems like she was testing the boundaries, pushing further and further to see how much control she could wield, how much she could get away with. And tragically, with each step, the consequences became more dire.
The police investigation that followed was massive.
Yeah.
They questioned over 1,200 children, trying to understand what happened. And here again, we see a stark contrast between Mary and Norma's behavior.
The material describes Norma as increasingly nervous, inconsistent in her statements during questioning.
Right.
But Mary remained incredibly calm and collected, even going so far as to try to blame another boy. It's almost as if she was enjoying the attention, playing this twisted game with the authorities.
And yet, despite her attempts at manipulation, there are these cracks in her facade. Her very specific knowledge of the crime scene, particularly details that an innocent bystander wouldn't know, raised red flags. It seemed like she couldn't help but reveal her involvement, even as she tried to deflect blame, which speaks to a very complex psychological state.
It's heartbreaking in a way. You have this child who has learned to manipulate and control as a survival mechanism. Mm-hmm. And those very skills are now being used to cover up these horrific acts.
What's this duality? The mix of vulnerability and calculated behavior, that makes Maribel's case so fascinating and unsettling. And this duality becomes even more apparent during her trial, which we'll dig into next time. Welcome back to our deep dive. We left off talking about those really stark differences between Mary and Norma's behavior during the investigation.
Right, with Norma kind of crumbling under pressure while Mary was almost eerily calm and collected. It really raises questions about Norma's role in all this. Mm-hmm. Was she a willing participant, or was she manipulated by Mary?
Well, that was one of the central questions going into the trial, which began December of 1968. Can you imagine being in that courtroom?
Oh, gosh.
Seeing these two young girls facing such serious charges?
It must have been just incredibly surreal. It's hard to even wrap your head around it. And the sources say that the prosecution really honed in on Mary as the leader, the one calling the shots. They painted her as this master manipulator who used Norma to kind of help carry out her plans.
And they built a strong case. They had the forensic evidence connecting Mary to the crimes, her own statements, which, though disturbing, also revealed this level of awareness and understanding that was unsettling for a child her age.
But the defense presented a very different picture, didn't they?
They did. They argued that Mary was suffering from what's called diminished responsibility.
Okay.
Essentially, they were saying that due to her extremely troubled upbringing and a potential psychological condition, she wasn't fully capable of understanding the consequences of her actions.
So walk me through that. How did they make that case?
Well, they brought in experts who assessed Mary and concluded that she displayed psychopathic tendencies.
Okay.
It's a complex diagnosis, but essentially it suggests a lack of empathy and remorse, a disregard for social norms, and a tendency towards manipulative and impulsive behavior. They argued that Mary's horrific upbringing, the abuse, the neglect, the exposure to violence, all contributed to the development of these traits. They also argued that a difficult birth may have played a role.
So they were essentially arguing that she was a product of her environment, that the trauma that she experienced shaped her in a way that made her more susceptible to these types of behaviors. It's that nature versus nurture debate, right?
Exactly. How much of who we are is predetermined by our biology and how much is shaped by our experiences. And in Mary's case, it seems like you have this incredibly unfortunate combination of both.
Yeah.
A potential predisposition to certain traits amplified by this deeply traumatic environment.
And how did Norma's defense approach the case?
Well, they took a very different approach. Their argument was that Norma was a follower, someone easily influenced by Mary's stronger personality.
Okay.
They essentially painted her as this naive bystander who got caught up in something she didn't fully understand.
It sounds like they were really trying to separate the two girls, to draw a clear distinction between them.
Right.
To argue that while Mary may have been the driving force, Norma was more of a pawn.
Right. They argued that she wasn't truly complicit in the murders, that she was just a scared kid who made some terrible decisions.
So after hearing all of this, what did the jury decide?
Well, after 9 days of deliberation, they reached a verdict. Mary Bell was found guilty of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Norma was acquitted.
Wow. That must have been a heavy moment in that courtroom. It's a verdict that seems to acknowledge the complexities of this case, recognizes that while Mary committed these horrific acts, her culpability was affected by her incredibly difficult background and psychological state.
It does. It really reflects the struggle to balance punishment with understanding. The jury seemed to grapple with the fact that she was both a perpetrator and a victim.
Yeah. And what about Norma? Acquitted at the time, but forever linked to this case. Makes you wonder what happened to her, how she coped with the aftermath of everything.
Unfortunately, the material really focuses on Mary's story.
Okay.
But you're right, Norma's experience is just as compelling. You know, to be thrust into such a horrific situation, potentially manipulated by someone you trusted, and then having to live with the consequences, the judgment, the constant reminders, it must have been incredibly difficult.
It's a powerful reminder that even in cases like this, there are multiple victims. The families of Martin Brown and Brian Howe, of course, suffered an unimaginable loss.
Yeah.
But Norma Bell, in a different way, was also a victim. Her life was irreversibly changed by her association with Mary.
Absolutely. And then there's Mary herself, sentenced to indefinite detention, which essentially meant an open-ended sentence.
Yeah.
She was just 11 years old when she entered the prison system.
It's hard to even fathom what that must have been like for her. A child in an adult prison grappling not only with the enormity of her actions, but also the harsh realities of prison life.
The sources even mention allegations of abuse within the prison system, which just makes this whole story feel even more tragic. You know, it raises serious questions about the effectiveness of incarcerating a child who had already suffered so much trauma.
It's like this vicious cycle, isn't it? A child is abused, neglected, surrounded by violence. They act out in these horrific ways, and then they're punished and potentially abused within the very system that's supposed to rehabilitate them. It makes you wonder if we're really addressing the core issues or just perpetuating them.
It's a crucial point. You know, Mary's case really highlights this desperate need for reform, for a system that focuses on rehabilitation and addresses the underlying trauma that often drives these kinds of behaviors, especially in young people.
So in 1980, at the age of 23, Mary Bell was released.
Right.
She was given a new identity, granted lifelong anonymity in an attempt to help her rebuild her life away from the shadow of her past.
And as you can imagine, this decision sparked a huge public outrage. Many people felt that her crimes were simply too horrific.
Yeah.
That her age didn't excuse the severity of what she'd done.
It brings up a really fundamental question. What is the purpose of our justice system? Is it about punishment, retribution, or is it also about rehabilitation? About giving people, even those who have committed terrible acts, a chance to change, to reintegrate into society?
It's a debate that's still going on today. Mary Bell's release, the granting of anonymity, was seen by many as a betrayal of justice, a slap in the face to the victims' families.
But there's another side to this, right?
There is.
The people who supported her release argued that she had served her time, that she'd undergone therapy, and that she deserved a chance at a new life. And they pointed to the fact that she was just a child when she committed these crimes. A child who had been failed by the very system that was now punishing her.
It's such a nuanced issue, and there are no easy answers. It gets even more complex when you consider that Mary co-authored a book about her life a few years later.
Right, Cries Unheard. The release of that book definitely stirred up a lot of controversy.
It did. Critics saw it as a blatant attempt to profit from her crimes, while supporters argued that it provided valuable insight into the mind of a child who had committed such terrible acts. It shines a light on the devastating impact of abuse and the complexities of rehabilitation.
It feels like this case really forces us to confront some pretty uncomfortable truths about ourselves, about our capacity for both good and evil, about the limits of our understanding, about our own potential for both compassion and judgment.
Absolutely. And maybe that's the most significant legacy of Mary Bell's story. It's not just a true crime case, a sensationalized story about a child killer. It's a reflection of our own societal failings, our struggles with trauma and justice, our own complicated capacity for both condemnation and forgiveness.
It's definitely a lot to process.
Yeah.
But I think that's what makes these deep dives so powerful.
I agree.
It's not about simple answers.
Right.
It's about wrestling with complexity, engaging with these difficult questions, but coming away with a deeper understanding of the world and our place in it.
I completely agree. As we head into the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore the years following Mary Bell's release, the impact her case had on the justice system, and the questions that continue to linger even today.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been unpacking this case of Mary Bell, tracing her path from a childhood filled with trauma to her conviction and eventual release.
And now we're going to look at what happened after she was released, how society reacted, and what enduring questions this case raises about justice, rehabilitation, even forgiveness.
So Mary Bell walks out of prison in 1980, a free woman, given a new identity and protected by a lifelong anonymity order. But you can't just erase the past, can you? Those crimes she committed as a child, they still cast a long shadow.
It's hard to even imagine the weight of that, the constant worry of being recognized, of having your past come to light. And for Mary, it wasn't just about herself. She had a daughter while she was in prison.
Right.
The anonymity extended to her child as well, to try and shield her from the stigma of her mother's past.
That raises all sorts of ethical and legal questions, doesn't it? The right to privacy versus the public's right to know. It's a difficult balance. And things got even more complex when Mary Bell co-authored a book about her life back in 1998. Cries Unheard.
Right.
That book really reignited the debate about her case. Some people saw it as exploitative, a way to profit from her crimes. Others argued that it provided a unique perspective, a look inside the mind of someone who did these terrible things as a child, and that it highlighted the complexities of rehabilitation.
Right. I think that's a big part of the reason why this case still fascinates people. It really hit on some sensitive nerves in society. It makes us think about those long-term consequences of childhood trauma, about how our justice system deals with young offenders, about our own capacity for judgment and maybe even compassion.
Yeah, it also challenges our whole idea of what evil is, doesn't it?
It does.
We want to believe that good and bad are clearly defined.
Right.
That evil is something easily recognizable and containable. But Mary Bell's story, it blurs those lines.
You're absolutely right. She was a child who committed horrific acts, a victim who became a perpetrator. And it makes us ask some very uncomfortable questions. Can a child truly be evil? How much responsibility can someone so young have for their actions, especially when you consider the abuse and neglect that they suffered?
And then there's the question of forgiveness. Is it even possible to forgive someone who has done something so terrible? Is it even our place to forgive? Especially when we weren't the ones directly harmed.
Those are questions that have really been debated for centuries. But Mary Bell's case puts them right in front of us. It forces us to consider them on a personal level.
So after diving deep into this case, what are some of the big takeaways? What lessons can we learn from Mary Bell's story?
Well, I think it's a stark reminder that childhood trauma can have devastating, far-reaching consequences. It's not something people just get over. It really underscores the need for early intervention, for support systems that can identify and address these issues before they escalate.
It also shines a light on the limitations of our justice system, especially when it comes to young people. Punishment alone doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't address the root causes. We need a system that focuses on rehabilitation, on giving people a real chance to change.
And finally, I think this case challenges us to confront our own biases, our own judgments about good and evil, forgiveness, redemption. Mary Bell's story is complicated and it's unsettling. It defies easy answers, but it's in those messy, uncomfortable places that we often find the most valuable lessons.
It reminds us that the world is complex, full of contradictions and gray areas. And sometimes the most important thing isn't about finding the right answers. It's about asking the right questions. The questions that make us think, challenge our assumptions, and force us to look inward.
And in the end, it's up to each of us to decide how we deal with those questions, how we navigate the murky waters of justice, forgiveness, accountability, and redemption. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
You've been listening to The Deep Dive. We hope this exploration of Mary Bell's case has challenged you, made you think, and maybe left you with more questions than answers.
Because sometimes the journey itself is where the real learning happens.